This is the Dirshu Mishnah Berurah as we once again learn another Siman in Hilchos Krishma. Today we're learning Siman Ayin Gimel, in which the Mechaber coins a Yoshin Mishto Banavechis Nayeg, someone who's lying with his wife and children, what he should do. So says the Mechaber Shnaim Sheyeshinim B'Talis Echad, two people are lying under one talis, Ubasar Shneiam Noyim Zeh B'Zeh. And of course, we have to remind ourselves that back in the world of Shulchan Aruch, the most prevalent, there was no such thing as pajamas really, and they would sleep without any clothing. So says the Mechaber, if two people are lying together under one talis, under one blanket, and their skin and their flesh is touching each other, lo yikra kri Shema, they can't say Shema Elam Ki. And I said, talisman seconds, unless the talis, unless the garment, unless the blanket separates between them, from their loins, literally from their waist and below. So says the Mishnah Berurah over here, noigim, that their bodies are touching each other, not kan noigim. Mishum da asr likros below sakis talis, because then you can't say Shema. Says Mishnah Berurah, even if you want to turn away from the other person, so the erva is not towards each other, rather their backsides are towards each other, still the only way to say Shema, if they're touching, their skin is touching each other, is if there's a talus separating between them. If they're lying face to face, you can't read without a talus in between them. Even if they're not touching, if you're close to one another. And of course, this is going to be most prevalent nowadays with husband and wife lying together in one bed. And therefore, from here, we're learning important halachas, that if they're facing towards each other, both undressed under one blanket, you cannot say Shema, even if they're not touching each other, unless there is the blanket separating in between them. But if they turn not face to face, then the issue is only if they're touching each other. If they're not touching each other, then there is no issue, and then they could say Shema. Says Mishnah Berurah, why? Because you might come to be maharer the fact that there's skin to skin contact. If there is a garment, if there is the blanket that separates between them, then even if they're face to face, it is allowed. Because there's something separating. But now this is all from the masneim ulamata, from the waist and below. Sivkat and Dalet explains the Mishnah Berurah. If their arms are touching, their chests are touching, they hear it's not a problem. V'da, says the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, an important detail. This is only going to be if their head is out of the blanket. Reminds us, the Mishnah Berurah says, this is only going to be if their eyes are not going to see the erva. And also if the press on your heart, so that your heart does not see the erva. We'll come on, Siman Ayin Dalet. Ayin Sham Sivkata Beis Mashkam no Eid Bazeh. Because of Prichadish near Allah, Dim Diavid Kara Beloy Chazar's Panim Beloy Sakis Talis Yatz De Chavas Ayin Sham. So B'Diavid your Yaitse says. So this Mishnah Berurah is really a loaded Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah just taught us some very important halachas which aren't even mentioned over here. The number one, this whole story only begins if you can't actually see erva, meaning if your eyes are not under the same blanket, and therefore you're not actually able to see the erva. That's number one. Number two, says the Mishnah Berurah, this only begins that if it's not liba yuroya es erva, if one is under a blanket undressed, then his heart could see his erva as they're both in the same area, and that's going to be a problem as well. So to take care of these two issues, number one, the head has to be out of the talus, and number two, one has to press down on his heart with the blanket, with the beged, because by pressing down, that creates a separation between the lave and the erva. If those two details are taken into account, then one could do what we are learning here in Siv Aleph, which is if they're facing to each other, even if they're not touching one another, you have to have the blanket separated between them. And if they're facing back to back, then if they're touching one another, then you have to have the beged in between them. And we continue over here with Sif Beis. Just for one moment, important to mention the Dirshu over here. I don't have it open on the screen, but the Dirshu points out that, one second over here. Okay, now the Dirshu has some nice cases, but for right now, let's not confuse things. Let's go to Siv Beis. So says the Mechaber, like we just said, if you're lying with your wife, you turn away, and then you can say Shema. Even if the talis is not separating them, Misham the Chashiva ki gufa. So we're seeing over here there's a little bit more of a leniency with one's wife. And some are more machmer, and you should be chayshish for them. So says Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Hey Mishnah Misham the Ishta Kigufay V'Rag above Leka here. So in Sif Aleph, as Mishnah Berurah pointed out numerous times, what was the detail that we were worried about is here that if one's skin is touching another, it could come the hair to think inappropriate thoughts, but by one's wife, and one is accustomed to such a situation, then we don't have to worry about that. But still, says Mishnah Berurah, you need to turn away your face. Dirshu over here, this number 7 quotes a Chazon Ish that says even if you don't turn away, it's going to be okay as well. The panim lahadi panim you should like here because if you're face to face, it's impossible not to be here. Says Mishnah Berurah. Let's say just a man turns around. He's allowed to say Shema D'Shav like here because he doesn't have here. As long as his basar, as long as he is not touching her, let's say they both want to say Shema, they both have to turn away from each other. And even if their back sides are going to be touching one another, it'll be mutter. Even though in Sif Aleph we said that if one is touching flesh to flesh, it's a problem. But that was when it's not one's wife. When it's one's wife, if their backs are touching each other, it's not going to be an issue. However, Sivkat involved, the Mishnah Berurah says still nachin lachish that it's usher ratzalaimer b'loy afsakas talis, that we should be machmer if there's not a beged separating the feet of Reim zarchim ba'oidli zarbas abikriyish mashalamita ubeberach zamabil, as we pointed out, shebeneim afsakas talis vazafilu panim ladei panim moter. And this is really the take home of today's shiur, that when one is saying Kriya Shema Lamita, as well as a Berachas HaMabil, husband and wife together, even if they're lying together without any clothing on, what is the appropriate way of saying Shema is to put the talis separating in between them. But of course, we remind ourselves that as well, the head cannot be under the talis, because then you'll see the arava. Number 2, as long as you have to have that the liboy is not roya as arava, and the way to do that is to push down on one's chest with the blanket in order that there is this separation between the lave and the erva. We continue with Sif Gimel. Ima Yashim and Banav want to stick with his children, by the Kitanim other children, even though, again, not so common in our world, even though they're all lying addressed, you're allowed to just turn your face, even though there's nothing separating between them, and say Shema and Gedolim, then Sarach Afsakas Talis. Let's just take this together with Sif Dalid. Ad Kamei Chashuvin Kitanim, until when is a child Katan? Hatinok, actually, Yibei Shanim, Hatinok is actually Yud Aleph Shanim. A boy is 12, a girl is 11. Afilu Beish Deisayr is Mutter. Bishnas Yud Gimel Hatinok, Yud Beis Latinoikas. The 13th year of a boy, the 12th year of a girl, and maybe Yish Deisayr is also B'Lafsik. V'Mloiv Yish Deisayr is Mutter. Bishnas Yud Gimel Veilach Latinoik, Yud Beis Latinoikas, Afilu Yish Deisayr, it's going to be a sur. Says the Mishnah Berurah of Katan Zayin im Banav Del Dedu Lukuli Amar Minikim the Gas. This is even more than one's wife. So again, Sif Aleph was really any two people lying together undressed. Sif Beis is lying together with one's wife. Sif Gimel and Dalet is one's children. And each time it becomes more flesh of oneself by one's wife, it's Ishlik Gufay, so there's no here. By one's children, there's certainly no here. Even in that case, and of course, another reason why it's not going to be Nageya is because even if, let's say, maybe one would say a case of a woman feeding a baby, and therefore there is basar al basar, flesh to flesh, but in that case, usually the baby is going to be wearing a diaper, and therefore that's as well going to take care of this concern. But Chazar is banim sefkat and ches, hainu she'achayreim zelazeh back to back. Banav neged achayrav, the face of the child is facing backwards. Sarch al kavan lizar shliye besar negeh beraval son ken yerli. Right? When it comes to an idol, if hey the muchem besar negeh beraval son chaveiroi to muchem that if his flesh is touching his friend's flesh, kam kein aser, as we'll get to in the next year, Mirz Hashem. Other children which are not your one's own. Ach, lafi mashmur like when Siman Yosef Dalid, but God the cotton calls man shein rayu lebia ainu bezachrat shanu yom echad bin kevad bas yud arbas gimel v'yom echad ein eravasay erva del chayr gam nini yishlak lemadayin legia azman. And we conclude with Sif Katan Yud Aleph dealing with the age when one is considered a katan and a ketana, b'shas Yud Gimel. So during the 13th year of a boy, when the first day of this year begins, when the 13th year is completed. Just a complete 13 years. The Yom Leida Gamkin Bechlal is included. Kigoin. Afilim Neilad Be'echad B'Tishim Safayim Shabbat Tzchiz L'El Yudal Shanayla By Hainu Echad Tishim Nishal Loy Hayud Gimel Shanav Dinase Gadol. His din of a Gadol on the birthday. Chen Adin Linin Bar Mitzvah. And we've seen this already when we spoke about davening for the Amud. We saw the same halacha that you have a din of a Gadol at the moment that they reach the age of 13. Ach Desham Be'inin Gamkin Shtei Cyrus, as we learned. And finally, also, in Sif in Chav Aleph, we learned that they have a din of a gadol and a gedaylah with regard to erva, even if they don't bring shtei sayers. You're not even allowed to lie together, undressed. And we will stop over here and pick it up from Siman Ayin Daled in the next year. B'siyata Dishmaya.